You.
Thank you very much. And can I welcome our speakers to come on screen uh, and I'll be introducing you. Thank you, thank you. So we move really from the academic world into human rights education beyond the law school. So I'm very excited to welcome a really stellar panel and to hear what they have to say. I'll do some very short introductions. We've provided our speakers with a couple of guiding questions before the session today, so I'll be inviting them to answer those questions. First of all, I'd like to introduce and welcome Sabrina Matani, who is a Zambian British lawyer with 20 years of experience working on access to justice for women. She co-founded Advocate, an NGO in Sierra Leone that provides access to justice to women in detention. She's previously worked for Amnesty International, the Elders, UNODC, Penal Reform International, and the Clooney Foundation for Justice. She's the founder of Women Beyond Walls, a global collaborative that challenges the mass incarceration and over-criminalization of women through research, advocacy, storytelling, and litigation. She is a research associate at the Centre for Criminology at the University of Oxford and regularly speaks at international fora and media platforms on how to improve justice outcomes for women and girls. So you're very welcome, Sabrina. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Samantha Knights, KC, who is an established practitioner at Matrix, one of the leading sets of barristers' chambers in human rights. In practice, she specialises in public law, immigration, asylum, and trafficking law in particular. She is instructed in the case of Shamina Begum. She has also been instructed in the post-op inquiry for the past 3 years. She is the chair of the advisory board of the European Human Rights Advocacy Centre, former adjunct professor at the University of Miami School of Law, where she co-taught the International Human Rights Law class, and the author of 2 books on law, rights, and religion. Samantha, you're very welcome. Robert Fellner is the founder of Human Rights Careers. Robert is deeply passionate about empowering and equipping young and seasoned professionals with the knowledge, skills, and resources that they need to thrive in their human rights careers. Robert has previously worked in human rights education and communication roles for Amnesty International, the International Centre of Migration Policy Development, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the UN Institute for Training and Research. Today, his work focuses strongly on the intersection between education, technology, communications, and human rights entrepreneurship. Robert, you're very welcome. And our final speaker who I'm mentioning is Friso Roskam Abing, who is the head of the Brussels Liaison Office of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, which is the independent centre of reference and excellence for promoting and protecting human rights in the EU. He is a curator of the Fundamental Rights Forum, the space for dialogue on human rights challenges facing the EU today. He was previously a spokesperson on freedom, security and justice at the European Commission, cabinet member, and headed the sector in the Commission dealing with asylum and refugee policy. Before that, he led the EU Office of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, a European network of 100 plus NGOs in 40 European countries protecting and advancing the rights of refugees, asylum seekers and displaced people. He teaches strategic human rights communication as part of the master's programme at the Venice-based Global Campus of Human Rights, a network of over 100 universities training and empowering the next generation of human rights and democracy professionals. So I think you'll agree we have an incredibly impressive panel here today. The first question that I wanted to ask you all, and I'll go in the order that I introduced you, so this is to Sabrina, is what does human rights education beyond the university setting mean to you?
Thank you so much for having me, Vicky, and all the organisers on this really prestigious panel. It's such an honour to be here. I think, this is a really important question, particularly as we've had a lot of discussions within the legal profession over the last few years about legal empowerment. And this is really building the knowledge and power of people to solve injustices themselves. So really giving people the power to know, use, and shape the law. And of course, the legal profession is one rooted in a lot of tradition, hierarchy, and privilege, which can often be unwittingly gatekeepers of legal information. And so I think this is where legal empowerment and human rights education comes in to be really able to share this information and to better empower people to know their rights and to enforce them. Of course, always a need for lawyers, but I think spreading this information and empowering people is really critical. And perhaps to put this into an example, when I was working with Advocate in Sierra Leone, we conducted a lot of legal rights trainings for sex worker groups. Many of them were often targeted by the police, arbitrarily arrested or abused. And we didn't only just provide legal services to them, but actually empowered them to know about their rights and how to deal with different issues. And this actually had a huge impact because sex workers were able to rely on each other. Often the different sex worker groups were there present or could, respond more quickly. But then it created a really good referral pathway where they did need extra support or ability to kind of either support with a case or kind of file something around police accountability. So that's just one example, I think, about legal empowerment. And I have many more examples, but I will hand over to our other kind of panelists and hopefully address some of them later. Thank you.
Thank you for starting the conversation. If I may invite Samantha to offer your thoughts about this question.
Thank you, first of all, to everybody who's made today happen. It's been a really wonderful afternoon. I wanted to really, I think, talk about two things. One, a personal example of how I got into human rights in the first place, but in coming from a context where I hadn't had a human rights education. So this was post my university education. I did an undergrad in modern history. And my first job was based in Estonia as a journalist for an English language newspaper. And I had previously spent a year in the Soviet Union. So I was sort of very conscious of human rights issues per se, but hadn't had any legal training and hadn't had any human rights education in my sort of trajectory up until the early 90s. But one of the stories I was sent to cover was a group of Iraqi refugees who were imprisoned in an ex-Soviet prison in Estonia. And I, went to see them, I talked to them, and I had, like they did, a shared sense of the incredible injustice. They hadn't committed any criminal offence, but there they were, stuck in a prison. And I didn't realise, of course, or didn't understand the context of the Refugee Convention, not being a lawyer at that time. But I came away with, I suppose, an underlying concern that they had no advocates, they had no lawyers. And I went to interview the Home Affairs Minister, who didn't really have a plan. And it was that experience, actually, which triggered my sort of trajectory into law in the first place, and then sort of later in my legal career into refugee law. But I wanted to say something next, just more generally about human rights, because I get asked so much by young students who are interested in going into human rights about how they get into human rights, how they can get into chambers or a firm that does human rights. What I say to them, of course, is that wherever you end up as a lawyer, you will, to some extent be doing human rights, or you will have the capacity to do an enormous amount of good, whether you're in a small regional firm doing property law, whether you're in a huge commercial firm, or if you're in a chambers, doing housing or employment. Human rights is available as a lawyer to be used, and you can do so much good in so many different ways. So, for example, when I was in my first set where I was doing bankruptcy and trustee, and there was trust law, and there was a certain amount of skepticism, I have to say, amongst my colleagues when the Human Rights Act came into force. What relevance would it have for them? They were working in an area that they didn't consider there was any real need for human rights, wrongly, I think, and in fact. But of course, at that time, it allowed me to work with various organisations like the Bar Human Rights Committee, with the European Human Rights Advocacy Centre, and I developed various rule of law projects and human rights projects through that, both domestically and abroad. And I volunteered at the Law Centre. So, all of those things possible in a context where I wasn't doing per se human rights law. Obviously, when I moved to Matrix, I was specialising in public law, and pretty much every case I work on has a human rights element. But I think it's really important to to impress upon students that whatever they do in life, human rights is going to be part and parcel, if they want it to be, of what they experience and what they can, if they want to, practice as well.
Thank you very much indeed. If I might invite Robert to offer your thoughts on this question.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for the invitation, and Friso, Samantha, and Sabrina. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with you. I'll jump straight into answering the question, not to take up too much time. So for me, human rights education beyond the university setting is a lot about making human rights education more accessible to everyone, everywhere. And in this context, in particular, to those who are not able to pursue expensive master degrees. And in my smaller world, the world of instructional design, human rights education is about this quite exciting quest to develop learning experiences that are accessible, that are inclusive, that are participatory and action-oriented. So it's basically about trying to answer the question, how can we truly equip people with the knowledge, skills, and values to take action through online learning. And another aspect that I would like to briefly mention is what a dear friend of mine, Kritika Vishwanath, said during our time at Amnesty. She said human rights education is so important because everyone who is in the field somehow goes through it in some way, be it on the job, be it in a community center, at school, in other settings. So it's very often the start of a human rights journey. And I think that's one of the things that make it so important.
Thank you very much. And finally, may I invite you, Friso, to share?
Thank you, Vicky. Firstly, can I just check if you can hear me properly?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, and there's not too much noise in the background? Perfect, thank you. Second disclaimer is I apologize. I could only join just 10 minutes ago or something. It's very rude, but it was unfortunately the only way I could participate. So I haven't heard what has been, as Samantha said, apparently a very engaging afternoon, which I regret. I see it's recorded, so that is good for me to know. Vicky, you may recall that when you asked me and you sent me these questions, I was myself initially a little bit puzzled, because for me, human rights education actually is per definition beyond the university. Initially, I never thought of human rights education as meaning we're going to teach about the international humanitarian law, human rights law, etc. Because I myself and the agency I work for, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, would consider this to be first and foremost at incredibly basic level, primary, secondary education, which is something which we would continue to plead for, maybe more than ever. Let's have human rights education as early as possible in the school curricula to teach children, and of course, each and every time adjusted to what they can, in a cognitive manner, handle, but critical thinking. What is democracy? Digital and media, particular social media literacy skills, Holocaust education, and human rights. Because for me, human rights education it should be, I think, more about underlining that human rights are not a set of laws, however important they are. I'm a lawyer myself, a very bad one, but still a lawyer, so I respect the law a lot. But human rights are really much more about what defines us. It's the air we breathe. So it is so utterly basic that we just need to start as early as we can at primary level, and just make sure that everyone has human rights, what they are, rights awareness. And with this, hopefully, optimistic, romantic, and naive as I am, therewith building support for the protection and promotion of human rights. Let me just keep it for there, and I come in with the other questions.
Thank you, and thank you all for sort of starting this conversation off with your various different lenses. I wanted to think about sort of what's happening outside and above and beyond the university setting, and asking you to share any innovative or creative practices that you've seen or that you've used, sorry, in teaching human rights, and sharing with us particularly why these were initiatives were successful. So if I can start again with Sabrina and we continue from there.
Thank you so much, Vicky. So I've been involved in trying to use the media and different kind of creative approaches to human rights education and legal empowerment. So one example is the Women Beyond Walls podcast, which features women with lived experience of prison from around the world and lots of different practitioners who are trying to reimagine a kind of a different justice system. And this has been really important, I think, to kind of change some of the stigma, but also to get some of these stories out there to a wide range of people. And, you know, many people don't think about prison or listen to people in prison because they are kind of locked behind prison walls. And so we've seen some really interesting feedback. A judge from Kenya heard our podcast and said she was going to think differently about how to sentence women, like really taking into account histories of violence or motherhood. An academic put it on her curriculum for students. And again, I thought that was really important to try and broaden out some of the perspectives that students have. Another example from Sierra Leone was we created a legal education TV series. And this was a really great way of, you know, engaging people, though it was a very dynamic and kind of, you know, interesting TV show. And it simplified the way to kind of share basic legal information, but also it created a safer space to talk about issues such as corruption in the police, because people could talk about the characters in the TV show rather than addressing people directly. Another thing we did in Sierra Leone was a music video. So we got a really famous women musician, and she went in and did a music video in the prison. And again, that was a really important way to engage young people to think about some of their legal rights. Another thing I've been involved in is a human rights film festival. I think, you know, film and documentary storytelling is so important to be able to, again, create discussions. And often we would show a film and then have civil society groups to kind of answer questions from people. And we found that as a really engaging way, particularly around very sensitive topics, for example, around queer rights. And actually, by sharing a personal story, this enabled people to engage in this in a different way. Another thing I've been involved with is creating a fellowship program for early career women lawyers. And I do think, particularly for marginalized groups, these sorts of specialized programs are really important. We know around the world it can be very difficult for women to enter human rights for a wide variety of reasons, and many women don't stay in human rights professions. And this fellowship program based 10 early career women lawyers with civil society organizations across the continent. They were given a salary for a year and they had really practical experience, but also mentorship. And I think mentorship is something we forget about. Just when, you know, you leave law school doesn't mean that your learning journey or the obstacles you face end. And having this mentorship, not only from kind of within myself running the program, but also the lawyers that they were placed with, but also themselves in creating this sort of feminist network for life, really, that they can rely on. But built within that fellowship program, these young women lawyers had an obligation to kind of give back. And so they would do rights education in schools in the countries that they were based in. And so this was like a really important program, as well as, of course, being able to work on human rights cases with direct practical experience. So I think that program is now going on for about 3 years. And Vicky, I know you've been involved with it as well. And I think it's a really good model, and I hope it will expand. And just lastly, I think another thing is, of course, human rights education and learning doesn't stop. Another thing I've been involved in with UNODC is an e-learning platform on gender-responsive non-custodial measures. And I think this is really important. When I was at law school, I never had a gender lens when I looked at the criminal law. This was not taught. And I think, you know, being able to adapt and bring in some more feminist perspectives to legal learning is so important. And this e-learning platform was designed for a wide variety of practitioners, from lawyers to people working in the criminal justice system to students, to really engage them to think about how can the legal system, which was created by men for men, you know, be more gender responsive. So yeah, thank you so much. I have more examples to share, but I will end there.
Thank you so much for sharing the breadth and depth of all the different ways and means that we can deliver human rights education. If I can invite Samantha to share your thoughts about any creative endeavours that you've seen.
Yes, I mean, three different areas for me. One of the opportunities for when I left London was a move to the southwest, a move to a very small village in East Devon. One is aware of the lack of, I don't know, access to, for example, high level talks, and we're talking about an era when I moved initially, which was pre Zoom and online. And I co-founded a festival in this little village called Shoot, which is now in its 10th year, the festival. And through that, we were able to do a number of events with a human rights theme broadly, and bring them to people who probably weren't hostile necessarily to human rights, but probably didn't think about it, and certainly didn't have a human rights background or education. And one of the events I was really proud of was bringing a film about a death row artist, Kenny Reams, whose case I worked on years and years ago when I was an intern at the Legal Defense Fund in New York as an amicus on an amicus internship. And at the end of the film, we were able to get Kenny to dial in from his cell, and that was, I think, for the people. I mean, watching the film was fairly powerful. It was a very well made film, but having the ability to dialogue with Kenny from his cell in Arkansas was really something. And we let him speak. People initially were a bit sort of, I think, stunned and weren't even too sure whether it was real. And I subsequently took his film to various universities as well, which is a sort of, in a way, an easier platform. But I've always been really passionate, and still am very passionate, about doing events in the locality to the general public. So that's one thing. And if anybody's interested, Shoot Festival, I'll put the link. It's just coming up, and we've got some wonderful speakers, including in the human rights field. But another sort of level is work experience. I really think it's incredibly important for students, whether or not they end up working as lawyers, but it doesn't really matter. But I think it's very important for them to get really good work experience. And I was very conscious with the local sixth form in Lyme Regis that it was very difficult for some of the students to get, London-related work experience, let alone law-related work experience. And so I've started an immersive summer school, which I've run for the last 3 years. And what I've tried to do with that is to, first of all, give them as much out of the classroom, out of an institution sort of learning experience. So, I took them, for example, into the post office inquiry. And in the breaks, they're able to talk to sub-postmasters, they're able to talk to lawyers, they're able to talk to barristers, solicitors, academics, and they met some of the really well-known sub-postmasters who've been on television a lot. And that, is a life-changing experience for students that they won't forget. It's so different, to that sort of very, I think, dry experience of reading cases. And so, I've tried to steer away from that in the week. And then I've been taking them, for example, into Lincoln's Inn, taking them for a lunch, so that again they can meet the legal sort of climate, if you like, the culture of these strange institutions that make up our legal system. I think that's a very important part of their experience, as well as obviously talking to them about cases and getting them to do practical exercises. So that's immersive work experience is something I'm very pleased about, and the students seem to enjoy it. And then the third thing is, I suppose, in my teaching, and I think this will apply to all of us who are here. And we all teach human rights to some degree, but the way in which it's taught is so important, and we have so much ability to make our courses innovative, mainstream, gender, race, culture, whatever, and that's really important. I inherited a course when I co-taught in Miami, and me and my co-teacher, Carrie Bettinger Lopez, looked at it, and we both had the same sort of eyebrow raising reaction, that there were almost no women on the reading list at all. So, you know, needless to say, we started again. So that I was really pleased with. And I suppose the other thing, as part of my teaching, is I've at university level is teaching a practical legal skills course, which is really trying to fill in gaps. Somebody earlier today mentioned the lack of trauma-informed lawyering on the curriculum. When I went through law school and bar school, there was no mandatory requirement for trauma-informed lawyering. And as I understand it, there still isn't. And Exeter's doing work on this, and it's really good to see because it's very, very important. So that was part of my course. I did a class on harassment, how not to harass and how not to be harassed. And I was so struck when I left law school, nobody had mentioned harassment at all. And once you go into the workplace, it's a real issue. And you need to talk about it to students. And it's quite hard to talk about it. This is referring again back to a question that was asked earlier about how to talk about difficult things. So, you know, the course I taught in a nutshell was about filling in the gaps in legal education. And again, I got very good feedback from Miami. They were very pleased to have the sort of bridge between practice and the sort of, you know, academic side of law. Enough from me. Thank you.
No, thank you indeed. And if I can invite Robert to share your thoughts about any innovative and creative practices that you've been using.
Thank you so much, Vicky and Samantha. Samantha, what you said is resonating with me quite a lot. I think that especially this through human rights, the method is something that we are not looking into enough in some cases. I think a lot of the innovation currently is focused on artificial intelligence. And I do think that, you know, some of the biggest challenges, maybe the aspirations also that we had at the Amnesty when we were launching our first massive open online courses on freedom of expression and refugee rights was personalization. So how can you make the content relevant to the individual learner when you have 50,000, 100,000 participants in a course? And I think that's where things like AI can, you know, help us a lot. We enable us to tailor the learning much more to the individual needs. But I also think that those innovations have to be handled with care. There's so many new challenges that are being introduced with it. You know it, bias, stereotype, hallucinations, data protection, authenticity. And I also think one of the bigger issues is how people consume information online. And that Human Rights Careers, the project that I'm leading, we do a lot of data analysis and also search engine optimization. So we see that many NGOs have lost half their website traffic. So basically, there is a wall now in between those websites and the user. And as we know, the content is being changed. So that's quite a big thing, in my opinion, that we need to be aware of. But I don't think that the biggest innovations in the human rights education space are going to come from AI in the foreseeable future. I think that it's actually more the small community spaces, the truly decentralized communities that have an active governance system. So the communities that emphasize human connection, and that are almost like a counter revolution or a backlash against the humanlessness, if you can say it like that, of AI. So I think those are the initiatives that will be very successful, that are decentralizing the human rights movement. That's where the innovation sits, in my opinion, in the future.
Thank you so much, and glad to hear that AI is somewhere in the mix and how we navigate that. And finally, Friso, may I invite you to share your thoughts about creative, innovative practices?
Yeah, just to say that I completely agree with Robert. And if I understand the experts well, a lot of jobs will be at stake, will be redundant because of artificial intelligence. However, not the ones where human connection is at stake. So I completely agree that this should be the central focus. And human connection also means listening well, taking people seriously, finding common ground. finding the appropriate language and the appropriate messenger. And in particular with human rights law, it's a necessary part of the law, but rather complicated. And even one word like equality or dignity, freedom even, are all very, very difficult and are now being interpreted, as we all can note, differently. So we need to find ways and means to really tell what human rights are all about. Let me briefly mention 4 initiatives which we took. I'm not sure if they're creative and if they were effective, but I just want to share them with you. Initially, our agency based in Vienna started issuing so-called school agenda, S, cool agenda. So we wanted to be cool ourselves. And this, of course, was about 15 years ago when there were still physical agendas. Maybe they are back a la mode, I don't know. But it was quite a nice idea. It was too big of a project for us to handle, but it would, in a low threshold manner, explain to students, to pupils, different human rights which they had. Sometimes, you know, based on the International Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women or other international days which figured in the agenda. So that was one, which wasn't so bad, but we couldn't sustain it. Secondly, one initiative which I hope you can see, this is called the 10 Keys to Effectively Communicating Human Rights. This is an initiative which we have taken as the Human Rights Agency in Vienna. And later, in total, 10 organizations mandated to protect and promote human rights in Europe, including the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Council of Europe, the Office of Democratic Institution Human Rights, and others, joined us in this exercise where we, in 10 keys, try to indicate how to most effectively pass on the message, what human rights are and how they can be best protected and promoted. And many of them are about listening well, reaching out, activating your audiences, voicing shared values, creating coalitions, finding the right messenger, and tailoring your timing. So this has become a quite popular product. I would highly recommend, and I will share a link. It's already there. Wonderful. Thank you, Louise. Just to say that this is free. Everybody can download it, can office it from the so-called publication office based in Luxembourg. It's available, this is important for you to know, in 30 languages. So not only the EU languages, Russian, Turkish, Armenian, I guess. So please check this out. Based on this rather successful first exercise, we're currently working with this aforementioned group coalition of 10 organizations on a so-called rule of law explainer. Again, the rule of law is a very difficult, complex concept to explain, but it is, as we will all be able to agree, regrettably, increasingly under pressure, maybe even at stake, and not only in a few EU member states, but in more. So we need to find a way to provide a tool to what we call frontline communicators, could be those in national human rights institutions, quality bodies, civil society organizations, but even governments or other practitioners, how they can explain to a bigger segment, the wider public, what in strategic communication terms will be called the conflicted, persuadable middle, estimated to be 60% of the public. Please don't underestimate this, 60%. How we can explain to them the relevance of the rule of law in their daily life. And finally, Vicky was kind enough to mention that I'm also curator of the Fundamental Rights Forum, which we organize every 2 years. And there I have tried really to reach out to the unusual suspects as well, those from the world of the arts, the business, the tech, the sports, entertainment. So we had representatives from all those worlds, which I think is a win-win. We, in our side of human rights experts, we better understand how important it is to establish partnerships with them and the role and the impact they can play in educating about human rights, promoting human rights. And they will be better informed in the work they do and why it is so important that they play this role. So we had fantastic performances and discussions with former participants in the Eurovision Song Contest, former top football players who play an incredibly important role because they have, of course, that platform which all of us here in the panel don't have. So that is something which we will certainly continue, reach out to them, and very happy to provide any further details, anybody now or later.
Thank you, and thank you so much for sharing all the fantastic kind of endeavours and initiatives that you're taking. And I see that we have gone a little bit over time, and I'd love to carry on the conversation, but unfortunately I can't. So it's for me to say thank you, a huge thank you to you all for sharing your experiences and your insights and your recommendations. And we have links through the chat if anybody wants to follow up on anything that you've mentioned there. So it leaves me to hand back over to Fionn now, who is going to be leading our conversation with Dr. Malcolm Rogge, who is a lecturer at the University of Exeter Law School, business and human rights scholar and practitioner, and the international award-winning documentary filmmaker of the Tribunal. So thank you, panel, again.
Thank you very much. What a fascinating discussion. I'll just see if Dr. Rogge will join me by switching on his camera. Hello. Good afternoon. So I'm just going to do a short introduction, and then we're going to move into conversation. Thank you, Vicky, for that introduction. So as we all know, Dr. Rogge produced and directed The Tribunal, which hopefully many of you have watched, but if not, the link will be in the chat. And it's a documentary film about, well, many things, but human rights and international investment law. And it was made in partnership with the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University in New York. So what we're going to do, alongside the theme of the conference, is to discuss the multitude of ways that the tribunal can be used as a teaching tool for those teaching investment law, human rights, international governance, public international law, and more. Just a very short description of the documentary, and perhaps it would be better for Dr. Rogge to discuss that rather than me, and then we'll move on to the discussion.
Okay, so thank you very much, first of all, to all of you for the invitation, to Louise Loader, my colleague at Exeter. And I'm very pleased and humbled to be part of this conversation with with so many esteemed experts in practice and in academia and in the field in general. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this and for giving me another opportunity to showcase the film, The Tribunal. So yes, very briefly, the Tribunal was conceived through myself and colleagues at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, precisely with the idea of creating a tool that would help to communicate the complexities and deficiencies that that many argue are inherent in the way that the international investment law arbitration system is designed and how it operates in practice. And we thought that there was an opportunity to create a kind of case study that would have some wider appeal to try and illuminate some of the what is sometimes described as a shadowy system of international investment law. Certainly, it is a very technical one, and it is somebody earlier referred to the dry experience of reading case law. Well, I can attest to the very dry experience of reading international investment arbitration case law. So that was the idea, and we thought that the Copper Mesa versus Ecuador decision would be an opportunity to showcase that. And I had been involved many, many years working in Ecuador in different contexts, and also had made a film about the underlying conflict that is discussed in the Copper Mesa case. And so that's what we set out to do.
And the kind of methodology of how you delivered that, can you describe that to the audience? So how you went about, or what the documentary shows, in describing the impact of that huge investment on the community? How did you deliver that?
Thank you. Yes. So what we really wanted to do was to highlight and foreground the voices of affected community members. So this was the gap that we believed existed, and still does, of course, in this field of international investment law. And we wanted to allow and give an opportunity to affected community members to have a voice. And so that was essentially the main goal. And so the methodology that flows from that was me working with my colleagues in Ecuador, uh, and um, and building on the prior work that I had done there and the connections that I had in the affected area, which is the Intag Valley of Ecuador. So was to engage in a dialogue with affected stakeholders to the investment law dispute. And so that involved me. I spent a month in the field in Intag, conducting interviews, collecting additional material, images. And I think that the main point to make is that the interview process was a very lengthy one, and it took a lot of time to pull together the raw material that ultimately went through a very extensive editing process to be able to craft a narrative and tell a story that would be accessible not only to investment arbitration professionals like arbitrators and litigators, but also to a broad audience as well, including human rights students and also the wider public as well.
And getting that, or those, should I say, first person accounts from these stakeholders, how challenging was it to achieve that?
Okay, so the key, I think that the one thing that perhaps I can say to that is that I had the advantage of having had prior connections in the region. So if one were to do this without having these prior connections and understandings, this would be a very difficult thing to do and very time-consuming thing to do. Um, so there is that. The amount of material that I had to pull together was also a big challenge. And also when you watch the film, there's a story. There's actually a coherent narrative, but that coherent narrative is not told that way by the people who I'm interviewing. So that's a challenge, is to take all of this material from different people who see the conflict from different perspectives, who have different personal experiences and different levels of of having been of impact on themselves personally, and to take all of that information and to craft the narrative. And somebody earlier in this discussion referred to storytelling. And I think that that is absolutely right. That storytelling is a part of communicating the impacts of human rights abuses to your audience, whoever that might be. And so that was a big challenge, was to systematize and synthesize what is actually a disparate mix of impressions and ideas and experiences from all of the different interviewers, and to synthesize it into a narrative that's coherent and makes sense and has an impact.
And obviously, we're going to have the opportunity to use this as a teaching tool. And I think in the introduction, we talked about it being particularly relevant for the teaching of human rights in investment law, and really to demonstrate through storytelling, which is what all powerful advocacy is about, in my opinion. You tell a story, you show, don't tell, about how these human rights violations flow from bilateral investment treaties, which, you know, as you've discussed, if you study it from top down, can seem extremely dry, and even individuals would not realize about the impact on stakeholders, or those who should be stakeholders, and this is shown very, very powerfully. So what's your advice? And I know that it's been used in numerous different courses internationally, on how the tribunal can be used as a kind of focus into a module or a number of units about international investment law and human rights.
Okay, so yes, certainly the film can be incredibly useful for a class on international investment law. And so we've seen this happening around the world, the film being used in both in a sort of one-off colloquium seminar context, but also within modules in university classes. So just to give you some examples, the film has been used in a class at the Université Catholique du Louvain in law and social change for a fifth-year master's 2-level class. The film was used in a seminar for a module on mining law in transnational perspectives at Osgoode Hall Law School. At the University of Alberta in Canada, it was used in a module on rural communities and global economies. And in Nancy, France, in the Université de Nancy, France, it was used in energy geopolitics, a module on that. At Boston University, in a course on international law. And finally, my colleague in the business and human rights field, Humberto Cantu Rivera, showed it in his business and human rights module at the University of Monterrey in Mexico. So those are some examples of where, and there are many others, of how the film can be used in different contexts. Now, in terms of issues, I just jotted a few down. Of course, there's extractive industry and the environment and human rights, which is a huge field unto itself. Corporate social responsibility, business and human rights, climate change. And the reason I mentioned that is that many of the activists who are involved in Ecuador around these issues have a very strong focus on climate change and on the need to protect biodiversity. And then human rights defenders. So any discussion in your modules in human rights where you're getting into the United Nations recognition of human rights defenders as a particularly vulnerable group, and the various processes around human rights defenders, including that of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. Security and paramilitaries, I should have mentioned that in Toronto, the Nathanson Center on Transnational Crime, Security, and Human Rights showed the film. And the interest there is in the use of paramilitaries and critical minerals, just transition, and green sacrifice zones, those types of issues as well.
I mean, certainly the showing of the film, as you say, in a one-off module or a one-off seminar or a seminar of two can and will demonstrate or evoke conversation really. And as we talked about earlier on in this conference, from really with sixth formers at school, it could be done. I'm not suggesting it has been, but from first year undergrads to master students, there's so many different issues that can be teased out of it for a basic discussion. But it's also right, I would imagine, that a module could also be delivered. You show the film, you start a discussion, and then a number of classes could come off it about human rights skills, from reading the judgment or sections of it that can be highlighted, to perhaps interviewing skills. So in your documentary, clearly there's this wonderful storytelling that goes on, and you've explained to us today that this took years and years and years of understanding the environment, being involved, and working with the communities and the stakeholders in this dispute for well over a decade. But certainly all of these different areas could be utilized in teaching, not just beyond the showing of the film and the discussion, but a whole series of classes where you work on different parts of the issues that can be developed from all of the different elements of
I could, so yes, and of course, the film is 28 minutes, so it lends itself to be used at the beginning of a class, and then typically what I've seen happening is there's a Q&A afterwards. Now, somebody earlier, I believe it was Samantha, talked about bringing in the subjects themselves into the discussion online, and the difficulty with this film is that you have a language barrier. Because most of with the exception of one person, the affected community members, they don't speak any English. So that's an issue. So that's partly why we made the film, because it has translation and it can, to some extent, not substitute for that direct experience, but thinking practically in terms of having a non-English speaker in your Zoom call and requiring translation, it just raises some other practical barriers. There's the decision itself from the Investment Law Tribunal, which of course would be part of that module. There's a very long section in that decision, section 4, about the facts, the underlying facts from the perspective of the tribunal. So you have, I think, almost 100 pages of discussion about how the tribunal understood the conflict. And there's kind of an opportunity in classes to kind of think about how the tribunal portrays the conflict and what you see in the film. And then there's also commentary now that has been written about the film and also about the Copper Mesa decision. So it's attracted quite a bit of attention. Peter Mushlinsky, who is a professor emeritus at SOAS, who wrote the book on multinational enterprises and the law. He wrote a dedicated article about the Copper Mesa decision and the doctrinal issues that the tribunal struggled with, and his critique of how they attempted to resolve those issues. And he wrote a review of the film as well, which there's a link in the chat to that website with Peter Mushlinsky's review. and other academics have written about the decision as well. So there's a lot of material, and I think that gives, as Fionn has suggested, there you could construct multiple classes on this particular case using the film to start things off.
So we've got in relation to materials, the materials will be an output from the conference, and we'll make sure that some of the materials that we will be discussing will be on that. So some of the materials are, as you say, peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, but there are also for younger learners. There's quite a large amount of accessible material that is kind of impactful in relation to infographics and so forth, looking at the impact of the agreements really across South and Central America, and seeing how much this goes on as a learning tool for understanding the impacts of these bilateral investment treaties in themselves. And BIT in Central and South America, there's quite there's kind of follow-on material as well. Do you agree?
Absolutely. So certainly it really depends how you're framing your whole discussion about investment law and investment arbitration and the approach you're taking. One could take a very narrow technical approach, and what this project, which includes the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, provides is a way of a new approach to understanding the reality of these cases and their impacts on affected communities, and to fill that gap that I mentioned at the beginning, where affected community members are essentially absent from the conversation. And of course, this all feeds into a larger global effort to find ways to reform the international investment arbitration system. So that is a difficult problem to grapple with, in terms of it's such an entrenched system of interconnecting thousands of overlapping international investment treaties, bilateral treaties, and how to disentangle that and empower a different set of stakeholders is a very difficult problem to grapple with. And this film was used at the Working Group 3 meeting on investment law arbitration reform in Vienna, as it was presented as part of one of their sessions. And some of the arbitrators, like Toby Landau, have talked about the film, and people like Peter Mushlinsky, specifically in regards to this attempt to reform the system and to think about ways to address this gap, and to make to address the transparency issue and the accessibility issue. And that ties into this conversation about access to justice and how that relates to international investment arbitration, which, from the perspective of affected communities, we don't have access to justice. The system has actually been designed to exclude those groups. So what are the ways of addressing that? And we're in the middle of that debate, and I'm not sure where it's going, but yeah. So there, two of my colleagues, Ladin Mehranvar and her name escapes me. They've been specifically writing about the access to justice and international investment law problem. So look for Ladin Mehranvar. I'll put her name in the chat.
Well, access to justice is one of the incredibly powerful themes that hits you from the documentary. I mean, those of you who who haven't seen it, you obviously get these incredibly powerful first-person accounts, and as the story goes on, you see that some of the stakeholders have been invited to the tribunal to give evidence, and then they weren't called to give evidence. So they were, not only marginalized throughout, but then silenced at the tribunal. And then you have them looking at the judgment, and all of the violations that had been committed against the environment and against them had been redacted from the report. So it's incredibly powerful, and can lead to lots of interesting discussions and work for students on access to justice, and stakeholder silencing, and will be very, very, I think, interesting and useful for students and teachers to develop as they go along. And then obviously finally you've got the outrage at the end, where the decision was made and that the Copper Mesa Mining Corporation were in fact awarded, I think after deductions, about $19 million that the government had to pay them. And then there are some quite interesting discussions to be had about the kind of enabling of human rights offences that international organizations can either themselves or through people they've outsourced it to, commit these offences, and they are awarded large sums of money from the tribunal. And not only just access to justice, but justice itself, I think, can be very well discussed in relation to this story.
Yes, Peter Mushlinsky in particular highlights this paradox that I think you've just alluded to, which is the fact that in some ways, one of the critiques of the way that the tribunal tried to resolve this through a commercial litigation lens, essentially, basically as if this case was a purely economic dispute, which of course it was not only that. So Peter Mushlinsky dives into that. The point about access to justice as well, I would highlight in the film, there's a discussion with a woman named Sylvia Quilumbango, who is a environmental leader, environmental activist in INTAG, and also a college professor. And she really lays out, I think, in pretty stark terms, just how remote the investment arbitration tribunal process is from the community, and asks a whole series of questions of how and why and who are involved in adjudicating these conflicts, and raises, I think, some very basic questions that relate to access to justice. And I would also highlight the fact that the decision itself is only written in, there's no official Spanish version of the text. I've never seen a Spanish translation of the text. And most of the people who I interviewed, of course, had never actually seen the decision. And to what extent would it be helpful in another language as well is a big issue. So these compound in a very tangible and palpable way the deficiencies around access to justice in this particular system of investor-state dispute settlement.
Thank you very much. This has been a really interesting and engaging conversation. And I don't know if Louise has any questions. Otherwise, I will hand over to her. Thank you very much for coming, talking with us, and producing and directing this amazing, impactful, and insightful film. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fionn. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you both for an excellent conversation. And with that, we conclude this collaboration of the Human Rights Lawyers Association, the Association of Law Teachers, and the University of Exeter Law School. Huge thanks to Vicky Praise and Fionn Riley from the HRLA Executive Committee for their partnership on this event today. And of course, very special thanks to all of our speakers. Thank you for coming and sharing your experience and great practice. And to our audience as well, I hope that you found today's discussions to be valuable. Please do have a look for our event report summarising today's discussions. That will be on the HRLA and ALT websites soon. And on behalf of the HRLA Executive Committee, thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rogge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.